As many of you know, Just Like Nana is focused on honoring our ancestors. And we understand that sometimes some of those ancestors have engaged in behavior that is harmful or hurtful. And we're not excusing any of that behavior, but we're just acknowledging and recognizing that none of us have walked in that person's world and life. And we want to honor every individual's personal experience with as little judgment as we can. With that said, sometimes there are family members, whether they're ancestors or other types of family members, who currently, for lack of a better phrase, wreak havoc in your life and can be very destructive, harmful with what you are building and where your future is going. And so we just want to acknowledge that both of those things can be true. We can want to honor our ancestors, and we can sometimes have family members who we choose not to continue a relationship with as it exists in its current form because it's harmful to us. And so that's what this episode is about. And I just want to acknowledge that it's a little bit different than sometimes what we message, but also it's not. You can understand that everyone has their own experience, and you can draw a boundary around what makes sense for your life or your children's lives or your family's life. And that's what Harriet is here to address with us today. Welcome, Harriet. So excited to have you here today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Your body of work, your books, your podcast, everything you've put out there is just so empowering and such an important message for a lot of people to receive, to contemplate, to think about, how do I incorporate this into my own life? So really excited to talk about that with you today.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it's something that affects so many more people, probably everybody. And I feel like that's a really important thing for us to be able to talk about openly.
Exactly. Yeah. Without any stigma or shame or guilt. Absolutely. So let's start with, and if you don't have one, that's okay. But do you have a favorite or powerful memory about one of your grandmas?
I was thinking about this, and I don't think that I do have a particularly powerful or favorite memory of my grandma's. I only really knew my dad's mum, so I didn't really get to know my mum's side of the family. My mum's mum passed away long before I was born, and she had a stepmom who I think she got on with okay, but we were never particularly close. They lived 3 or 4 hours drive away. We just didn't really see them. But my dad's grandma, I don't have lots of favorite memories of her, but I do have memories of, I think, her being kind of what you think of when you think of the stereotypical grandma. Like, she'd got the curly white hair and, she would knit a lot and all those kind of things. So we think of as the stereotype. I think she really fit them. Where she perhaps didn't fit so well was with that kindness and that empathy and that real kind of loving and accepting feeling. That was not necessarily something that I associated with my grandma, although my personal experiences with her were not necessarily negative. But my mum's attitude towards my grandma could be very negative.
Yes. Okay. And when you're a child, that influences everything.
Yeah, I think it does. I think it has a big impact on the relationship that you can have. And I think my grandma could be quite cold at times, which would have been a fair assessment of her.
I'm curious, looking back on that as an adult and looking back on that with all your education and experience and all the people you've talked with and the books you've written, how do you view that now? Do you see how much she was hurting? I mean, not that it excuses anything, but I'm curious about your perception of it now.
Yeah, I think now as an adult, what I reflect on, particularly with my grandma, is that she was very much a product of her time. So there was a lot of stoicism, particularly in British culture, and I don't know how that transfers for you guys, but particularly in British culture, there was very much that generation of, stiff upper lip, you just get on with it, keep calm, carry on. You see it on all the mugs. That tended to be a really solid life philosophy for a lot of that generation that my grandma would have come from. So throughout all manner of adversity, I feel like my grandma had that. We don't really show emotion. We're not particularly affectionate. We're not particularly loving. By contrast, my granddad was much more affectionate, was much more loving. I remember clambering into his lap quite often and wanting to sit with him, whereas my grandma often felt a bit more withdrawn. And that's not to say that she wouldn't also be looking after me, but I think that her role in her mind was very much to be the person who was kind of, running the house, running the things, you doing the stuff, cooking dinner. She made a mean chicken in white wine sauce. It was delicious. And I think that was to her, okay, these are the jobs I have to tick off. And by the time I've ticked all of those off, it's time to sit down, maybe watch the TV, have a bit of a snooze. And my grandparents as well were older grandparents when I was born, right? Because my parents were older parents. So I think as well, I was coming to their lives as this tiny bundle of excitement, and they were already in that older phase of their life. They were tired a lot of the time and still trying to do the things to run a household. But I often feel like no one had particularly modeled to my grandma how to show that emotion, how to have that affectionate side.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you for sharing all of that. Let's talk a little bit about, because it kind of comes out of the story with your grandparents. What was your path to get to this amazing body of work that you're putting out into this world regarding, family relationships, estrangement, breaking cycles? What did that look like for you? How did you get there?
Well, for a start, the catalyst for that was ending up estranged from my mum and no longer having a relationship with my mum. What transpired after that was this feeling of shame, this feeling of not being able to talk about these experiences. And I have been a content creator for 11 years now. I was very used to sharing all of my life experiences, talking about, really controversial topics and never shying away from them. I was very much of the opinion that, anything goes. I'm sharing my life. People are kind of watching along as I'm living it. I will share everything. And this felt like something that I could not share. This felt like something that was, okay, this is going to be awful. I'm going to have this horrible reaction from people. I'm going to be really judged. I'm judging myself. I feel ashamed about this. It's so taboo. And people are going to be thinking, oh, she's had this great relationship with her mum. My mum had lived with us. So when I was no longer in that position and my mum was no longer living with us, it felt like people were really going to judge me. And some did, and that was fine. But actually, what I realized is people were messaging me and saying, well, where's your mum? I've watched you build her an annex on your property. An annex is like a granny house, like a separate little house for her. And I've watched this build happening, and now all of a sudden, there's nobody in it. What's going on? And I started replying to people, oh, my mum's moved out of there, and she no longer lives with us. And the amount of people that said, okay, I had that experience too. Or I would say, we weren't getting along so well, so mum's moved out. That's where we're at. And people would say, I really thought that some of the things that you would share didn't feel healthy. And they reminded me of my situation with my parents, me too. And it kind of moved out of this feeling of recognizing that I wasn't on my own, but everybody that I was speaking to felt like they were on their own. And recognizing that there was this lack of discussion. I have been through lots of experiences in my life, as many people have. I've been through relationship ups and downs. I've had new babies. I've lost babies. I've experienced various different things. I've talked about termination. There have been so many different things that I have experienced and always found someone talking about it, always found a community where I could find that healing. And there was nothing for this, or it felt like there was nothing. And I tried pretty hard to find stuff and there was no discussion. And I thought, okay, I feel like this is a space that I need to create. So from that, I created the Unfollowing Mum page. After I'd started talking about it on my own platforms, Unfollowing Mum became a really big community. I started the podcast, and then I requalified as a coach, an empowerment coach and a life coach. And then I started to train as a psychotherapist. I'm now a trainee psychotherapist. I own my own private practice, specifically working with adults who are navigating generational trauma, who are navigating childhood trauma, and those toxic family dynamics or estrangement.
I just really commend your courageousness. It's interesting because just like Nana is born out of this, so in my family, there was a lot of estrangement, various levels, all sorts of people. And we always called it not talking to, which I never quite understood. Like, this person is not talking to that person.
Yeah.
And whoever was doing the not talking was definitely the aggressor, the person who was bad, the person who was shamed. So I didn't have access to a lot of my family growing up and kind of felt just unmoored, I guess, from this earth, or, like, where is my place? Where do I belong? And through a series of events, what I sort of came to realize is, well, wait a minute, I could maybe access some of my ancestors without going through my mom. I could have my own direct relationship with them in a really powerful and meaningful way, particularly my grandma's with the name Elizabeth. So when I did a DNA test and I built out my family tree, and I found that I had 45 grandmas with the name Elizabeth. I mean, these, going back generations, obviously. And these are, women who weren't related to each other. So it's not as though the name was just following a line. So that just really called to me. But what I also wanted to go back to is just to reflect and honor that for me, as a person who didn't talk to my mom or was estranged from her, she's now passed, that shame and guilt and that feeling of I'm gonna say the two words, being a bad daughter, not appreciating everything she did for me, and all of that. It's just so powerful and deeply rooted, and as you mentioned, taboo, that thank you for creating a space that feels safe for people to share their experiences.
Well, thank you so much for saying that. And I think for me, what has been really important alongside being able to create this space and being able to have this community has also been how healing it has been for me. I am a big believer and a passionate advocate for group and community healing. And what I've found is that community of people who have shared lived experiences, despite the fact that all of their lived experiences will be different in some way, it's really powerful and it's really healing for everybody involved. And I think that's why it is so important to talk about these topics. You mentioned that shame there. Shame is such a huge, huge part of any difficult family dynamic, any toxic family dynamic. And it's felt so deeply and on such a fundamental level that it can be really difficult to navigate. But one of the biggest shifts I've noticed for people is when they hear someone else say, yeah, me too. I experienced that as well. And they know they're not on their own. Yes, they then have to go and do their own work. They then have to put that effort in. It's not just a magic fix of someone going, oh, me too. And them going, oh, right. Okay. I feel better now.
Yeah. Magic wand.
Yeah, it's a magic wand. There's nuance to it, but we've seen time and time again throughout society that having people relating to us and having that relationship where you know someone understands what you have experienced on a different level because they have experienced similar or they have experienced it too, is really powerful in helping to unlock that shame so you can start to work on it.
Exactly. One of the components that I see, everyone's situation is different, as you mentioned. There can be a component of, in a toxic relationship, some enmeshment
Mm-hmm.
and then the estrangement. And that was my situation. And because of the enmeshment, it can look a certain way to people from the outside, and I'm sure, as you were talking about, and we built this annex and mom lived with us. And so that can be a component, as well as people's reactions from the outside and not understanding, but this is what was happening internally. I want to be clear that, like, we're never trying to villainize anyone, but also it's okay to just be truthful about your experience of your relationships and your family. And I'm curious about your work with that, around just sort of acknowledging and speaking on, this is what I experienced and this is how it affected me.
Being able to talk about those things and being able to share my experiences, but also being able to work with people who are having those experiences. Like you say, it's not necessarily about villainizing somebody. It is about being able to speak your truth and share your truth. And what often happens, just talking about that enmeshment that you were discussing then, which I experienced very deeply and heavily relate to, that feeling of being the bad daughter versus being the good daughter. And what we often see in enmeshed relationships is that real drive to be the good daughter, to toe the line. And what happens there is a lack of self, because you're so busy trying to cater to your parents' needs and to your family members' needs that you don't develop that sense of self. You don't develop that autonomy. And I think as well, for a lot of people, what they don't realize, or what's missed in the discussion sometimes, is this can happen completely unintentionally. And for some
Yes.
people, very much intentionally. And that's really important to acknowledge, that whilst we don't villainize anyone and we don't demonize anyone, there are plenty of cases where someone does this intentionally and where someone intentionally causes harm. And it's okay for people to speak their truth about that. There are also plenty of cases where you have a family member who views their relationship with their child as, okay, no, we are best friends. We are super close. I can't even tell where she starts and I end. And that's amazing. And that's not amazing for your child. In fact, it can be really difficult for your child to navigate, and in a lot of instances, really harmful. And that sense of being engulfed can often come from a place of real love. And when I think about my relationship with my mum lost triplets before she had me. They passed away a few years, maybe 3-4 years before I was born. For her, that had a profound impact on how she viewed me as her child, and left unchallenged. And if you look at the broader picture of her own traumas and you look at the broader picture of her own life experiences, the way she was relating to me, the way she was treating me as her child, particularly as I was younger and I was growing up, very much speaks to those experiences. What I often see with clients is that there is a real willingness to understand that and to have empathy for that and to have awareness of that. But on the flip side, when challenged, there's no ability to be accountable. And that's when we see estrangements happen. I have never worked with someone who has had a life experience with a parent and gone, no matter what they say, no matter how much they change their behavior, no matter what happens, I won't have contact with them. And I've just decided that on a whim. Invariably, what happens is someone begs and begs and begs for changed behavior, constantly tries to express that, and is met with no accountability and is met with no change in behavior, and eventually just goes, I can't do this anymore. I can't keep going. And that's when the estrangement happens. And for some people, that estrangement isn't forever. For some people, that estrangement is, I need to tap out of this relationship and step away.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm aware of what's causing it. But if you can go and work on that, I'll work on me, you work on you. Maybe we can come back together and have some understanding. That's great. But that so often is not the case.
That is an incredibly powerful point that I hope really resonates and people, my listeners can really hear, is that oftentimes estrangement isn't just out of the blue, if you will. And it's not, this is what happened in the past. And because of what happened in the past, I will no longer have a relationship with you. Now, possibly for some people, that is how it happens and that's their truth and that's their path and that's fine. But for many people, it is that attempt to move forward with that relationship in a way that doesn't impede on your adult boundaries and, your own family life. And as you said, there's no sort of, for many situations, it's not even that there's not a willingness on the parent side to acknowledge. A lot of gaslighting can happen in that situation of, not only do I not acknowledge what you're saying, that's just wrong.
Yeah.
This is how it happened and all of that. And that's where the break comes. I'm curious about, I know you described that I think your oldest was 10 when your own estrangement occurred. Is that?
Yes. Yeah. He would have
Okay.
been. He would have been maybe 9 or 10.
And you talk about that, and it's a really powerful the way you talk about it. I'm curious about whether you understood or appreciated that you were in a trauma cycle or experiencing ancestral trauma before you had children, or whether the experience and context of mothering your own children helped you to see things differently, if it was a combination of both, sort of how that played out for you.
If you'd have asked me 10 years ago if I could ever imagine not having contact with my mum, I would have laughed and I would have said, no, my mum's my best friend. We have an amazing relationship. We're just super close. However, this is a question that I've pondered quite often because I've always talked about how for me, it took me 10 years or so to get to a point where I said no more and where my relationship with my mum ended. Because right from when I had children, there were things that I'd started to notice that I was so uncomfortable with. And that old, you'll understand when you're a parent. My parent didn't like what I did understand about her parenting once I became a parent, because I did understand and I didn't like it. And I was aware of how wrong it had been. That trope backfired because, yes, I did understand and I could see actually how wrong some of the things were that before, when applied to myself, I'd passed off as that's okay. That was just the way things were. But when applied to my children or watching patterns repeat with my children, absolutely not. And I do think there is that fierceness that often comes when you become a parent yourself. A lot of conversations that I have, not just with clients, but within the community, start with, I need to do this for my children, or I need to do this for future children, or I need to make these changes because it's impacting my kids. It almost always is easier, or there is a bigger call to focus on your children, focus on protecting them, where you have allowed that self-sacrifice to happen. However, despite all of that, through a fresh lens, and particularly through gaining the qualifications, through studying so much of this, and through really learning estrangement and toxic family dynamics inside and out and how we work, I think there were so many occasions when I recognized that my relationship with my mum was not okay. And so many occasions where almost stood from the outside, I could see that this was a repeat of behavior from when I was younger, maybe just slightly different. Or this would be there would be a moment of clarity when I would stand there and go, she's really enjoying this. And this is hurting me, but she's enjoying that this relationship is breaking down. Say it was a friendship or that it was a boyfriend or whatever it was. And she really enjoyed that in certain ways when that would happen with my dad or when I would want to call out my grandpa, whatever it would be. There would be those moments where I would be like, this doesn't feel right. And then I would very quickly close the lid on that voice and say, no, this is my mum. My mum is my everything. My mum is my best friend. My mum's got me in her interests. I'm all that she has. Let's just keep plodding along. So it was easier to shut that voice down. But as I reflect on it, I do think that that voice could be there at times, but I wasn't ready to hear it until I became a parent myself.
We've been talking about trauma cycles. From your perspective, how do you define that and how do you see it getting passed down through families?
That's a really great question. So when you think about a cycle, it starts somewhere and it starts with a message that we might internalize. That might be something that, say, for example, we have a family narrative. Let's think of it in those terms. That message gets passed on. If you think about it as like, there's a great reel that goes around on Instagram and on TikTok that is of somebody lighting a match and they pass it to the next generation with a message. And then that's guarded and it's passed to the next generation with a message. And the message might change a little bit, but it's still got that main thread. And it might be something along the lines of weight, for example. You need to lose weight in order to be loved by somebody. That can start with very early, great, great, great grandma. Oh, we've got to keep ourselves looking good for the men. And that then gets filtered onto perhaps, a good housewife keeps herself in shape. And then that might get filtered onto something else. And each generation will tweak it slightly with their own cultural and societal beliefs that prop that up. But the vein of it says, you're not good enough just as you are, you need to change.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where that cycle starts, is it gets passed down and it starts somewhere with a message and that message will evolve and it will change, but the thread will almost consistently stay the same. So that is often how I think about cycles when I talk about generational cycles with family. There are innumerable cycles that we can have, and so many of them can be outside of our awareness. We have no idea that we're doing these things or that we're carrying on these messages. You might sit there and say, well, I don't make comments about people's weight, so I don't have that message anymore. But actually you weigh yourself every day. So the message is still implicit. You see what I mean?
Yes.
So there are so many little things that we carry on. And as I say, they evolve. So they're sneaky. They could be really sneaky. And another area in which cycles and that generational trauma can be really prevalent are the things that are not said and the inherent biases that we carry throughout our family, the narrative of how our parents parented us, which is our model for how we become parents. So there is an author that I adore. She's a psychologist. She's called Dr. Emma Svanberg. And she talks about how parenting starts in your own nursery. So your experience as a parent starts in your nursery, because what you are experiencing from your primary caregivers and from your parents models and gives you the blueprint for your own parenting. So that's a cycle right there. You experience it and you go, this is how to be a parent. Or on the complete opposite of this is how to not parent, I will do the direct opposite, which often leads us into its own sticky situations because we think, okay, I had a very authoritarian parent. I wasn't allowed any freedoms. I wasn't allowed to. I hated that. I'm going to do the direct opposite. So I become a very permissive parent who has no boundaries, who is the best friend. And I think I'm doing an amazing job because I'm not like my parent and I knew that sucked. But actually, I've gone so far the other way that I'm also causing harm with my behavior. So the cycle begins again.
I just want to call out those kind of sneaky cycles are really the most powerful because you don't even know what's happening and they're just so ingrained.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about, a lot of your work focuses on healing this. So let's talk about that because that's your bailiwick and that's what's exciting. Tell me what being a cycle breaker means to you.
So being a cycle breaker for me means pulling the generational patterns and generational cycles that I have had in my own family line into my awareness. And that's the first big step, is being aware. What are these cycles? And actively choosing to work on them and to work on myself. What I want to note there, though, is that being a cycle breaker there for me is about pulling things into my awareness, but I am still okay with the fact that there will be things outside of my awareness. I say I'm okay with that. I wish I could have an awareness of everything. If somebody could hand me a checklist and be like, actually, all of this behavior is toxic, I'd be like, wow, that's amazing. I'll work on it all. I'll change it. Awesome. Thank you for that. That's not the reality. There will be things that will be outside of my awareness that my children will likely, and I hope, feel empowered to come to me and say, you did that and it wasn't okay and it hurt me.
Yeah.
Or you did that and I feel a kind of way about it. Let's talk about it. For me, that's one of my big cycles, is being able to empower my children to challenge me. And I have a 14-year-old now who will frequently challenge me
Yeah.
when he feels that I am speaking to him in a way that is unfair. And we often joke because he will sort of say, well, or I'll say to him, you wouldn't say that to dad. And he's like, no, I wouldn't, because I know I can say it to you. And a lot of people would hear that and think, oh, that's really bad. He doesn't have enough respect for you. Actually, quite the contrary. He knows I have that respect for him. He knows that he is safe to lose his temper with me and we will talk about it afterwards. He knows that he can express all those big feelings. And the other day on the phone, he'd been really rude. And I'd said to him, dude, this is the end of this conversation. The answer is no. You cannot go out with your friends. You have made a commitment. You are going to have to come home. You've got to sort that out. And actually, after a while, I thought about it and I thought, I'm probably being a bit harsh here. So we rang him back and my husband rang him and said, your mum's had a think about it. We're gonna say this week you can go out, but hey, you've got to pick up this responsibility. He didn't want to go to a club that he'd had, but he'd had a really long week. And I was being a bit harsh. So I was happy to admit that I was wrong. Again, another cycle, something that my mum could very, very rarely do, if ever, admit that she was wrong. So we rang him back and I was there on the phone and I said, hey, dude, yeah, your dad's called you because he wanted something else. And I'm just letting you know, dad's right. I think about it. And actually, maybe I was a bit harsh there. You can skip this, but let's make sure we do double sessions next week. Great. And then this little voice goes, I'm really sorry for how I spoke to you on the phone. Actually, I lost my temper a bit there and I probably shouldn't have done. Thanks for ringing me and letting me know. And I thought, how powerful is that already through modeling it, he knows that he lost his temper there and he's safe to be vulnerable and admit that he was wrong. And he knows that that's not going to be held against him. That's not going to get him into further trouble. Again, a cycle that's broken there. So all these little things are where we don't recognize that those cycles get broken. And I feel like what's really important to hold is that we will never break every cycle because we'll never be aware of them all. And there will be things that our children will choose to do differently. And that is absolutely okay. But one of the most fundamental things is empowering our children to feel like they can challenge us and they can let us know when we have slipped up, and being able to hear them in that accountable space. Being able to hear them in that space and be accountable for when we do make mistakes is one of the biggest parts of being a cycle breaker.
Yeah. I just want to acknowledge too, that can be a really difficult task for someone who recognizes their own toxic relationship with, their own family members, wants to break that cycle, tries their best to break that cycle, and then comes to discover, oh, wait, there were vestiges, there were pieces that, remained. And I'm calling it a cycle as though it's singular. And the whole point is that they're plural. There are many, many, many cycles. And, I just want to acknowledge that I actually have triplets. They are 25 years old and the parenting doesn't stop. And the cycle breaking doesn't stop. And it's really humbling powerful, fascinating to hear now their perspectives as young adults of certain situations or things that happened, and to really be able to hear that, understanding that underlying it all is love. No one's saying you didn't love me or I didn't love you, or, that sort of idea, but that we can continue to learn and grow, and that can be acknowledged. It's a really fun part of parenting. It's something to look forward to. And it's just been a joy.
It's lovely to hear you speak of it in that way. And as you were speaking then, what came up for me was this feeling of your children will trigger you in a way like nothing else. And I think that's
Yes.
really important to acknowledge, but also, we were talking at the beginning of your parenting journey, how that's when you start to pull into your awareness. And that is often when people start to pull into their awareness. Okay, these are things that I'm not happy with. There are flaws in my relationship. I would never treat my children that way. Why am I tolerating this behavior? All of those big things. But then there is almost this feeling of, okay, when my kids get a little bit older, they'll stop triggering me because I'm a parent now. I've done this for long enough. Absolutely, they will not.
No.
Every time your child does something that brings back a memory or a feeling or a ghost of anything from when you were their age, and bear in mind, there's always going to be that, your kids are 25 now. Well, you were 25 once. So the
Right.
things that they might experience, that they might feel, will bring things up for that version of you. And it's almost like if you think of yourself in multiplicities of having that inner child and then having that inner teenager. My inner teenager right now can stomp her feet something chronic because my teenager is prodding her buttons and going, you didn't get to do that. Or if you'd have spoken to your mum like that, this was the message. So, remember, this is how your mum would react. And with that then comes this is how I'm supposed to parent because this is how my mum would have to come out. And it's a constant battle of challenging those things and sitting with those feelings that your kids bring up and going, yes, that's my stuff. I need to think about that. I need to work on that. How do I do that? And sometimes that'll bleed through. And sometimes that has to be a conversation that says, hey, that was not about you. This came up for me. That wasn't your responsibility. And I apologize for that.
That's another really powerful message that I hope people hear, is that things will happen. You will mess up, all of that. The mistakes or the messing up, I don't think are the important part. I think it's the acknowledgement afterwards and the reparations and the moving forward together better.
Yes, absolutely. And I have a whole section in my book about rupture and repair, because people think if we never have a rupture in our relationship with our kids, then, tick, we've done an amazing job. We have bossed out that parenting. Actually, that's super unhealthy. If somebody comes to
Right.
me and says, I've never ever had a fallout, I've never had any kind of drama, I've never had any kind of issue with my partner, for example, I'm like, oh, red flag. And it's exactly the same in any relationship, because we're autonomous human beings. If there has never been a point at which there has been a rupture in the relationship, then there's been no opportunity for repair. And repair is where we build relationships. Repair is where we move forward through relationship difficulties. Repair is where the good stuff is. And that's why it's so important as cycle breakers to realize that it is okay if you have a rupture. I hate ruptures with my kids. They feel horrible, and everybody does. But when you are somebody who grew up in an environment where you've now ended up in an estrangement, ruptures feel even more scary, because you're like, oh, my kid's going to hate me. I must be doing everything wrong. And there's that real tendency to lean into that fear.
Yeah.
I must be doing everything wrong. My child hates me. I'm terrible. I'm messing this all up. But actually, there's security in knowing that ruptures happen, and it's the repair that makes the difference.
And it's the repair that teaches children, I'm me, you're you. We have differing views sometimes, and this is how we can interact with one another, even though we're not the same person and we don't think things the same way.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have two final questions that I want to make sure we get to. What resources do you recommend? If this is resonating with some listeners, where do you think people should start on their own
Oh,
path of sort of healing? And I mean, I know you looked into everything when you were trying to resource, how do I find something for myself?
I did. I did. And I feel like if this is resonating with you, then the Unfollowing Mum community is for you. You can find us on Instagram at Unfollowing Mum. You can find me on TikTok at It's Harriet Shearsmith. And I feel like my book, Unfollowing Mum in the UK or Cycle Breakers in the US,
Mhm.
is a really good place to start if you are looking for resources to help you in your parenting journey and to be able to move forward, to be able to say, how do I break these cycles and how do I live as a cycle breaker without it consuming me? I feel like those are really good places to start.
Wonderful. And do you have any sort of last words of wisdom or something that you would want? This is how I want you to think of this topic in my body of work.
I feel like we've really covered that throughout the conversation. I think one of the biggest things for me is that no one is entitled to you just because they are titled to you. No one has to have a relationship with anyone. And I think that's a phrase that I use really frequently. But another area that I think is really important for people to hold in their mind is it's okay that you're not going to break every cycle. It's okay for you to be a cycle breaker and to also make mistakes. It's okay for you to be a fallible human being who is going to make mistakes. It's in that repair. It's in that accountability. It's in moving forward in the relationship and owning your stuff.
I love that. With my adult children, I've tried to let go and recognize that part of their own cycle breaking and healing empowers them. So I don't want to excuse anything that I, did or didn't do or cycles I didn't break or anything, but also just recognizing that it's okay because that's their path and I can support that, but that is theirs and I don't need to own it. And that's really powerful and nice to know. Well, thank you so much for your time. So appreciated.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
So excited you were here today. Thank you so much for listening. I would love to hear your story. If you're interested in sharing it, please go to justlikenana.com to submit your story. There are also resources there if you're interested in learning more about discovering your ancestry or breaking some trauma cycles in your family. I have an ask of you. If you enjoyed today's show, I would love if you subscribed and let a friend know they might enjoy it as well. Talk to you again next week. Can't wait. Just Like Nana's theme song was written and performed by Carter Penny.